Well, good morning, everybody. It's great to have you join us for our second day of intellectual festivities tied to the 30th anniversary of the School of Global Policy and Strategy. I'm Peter Cowie, and I have the privilege of serving as the Dean of the school. In this, our 30th anniversary, we have framed these 2 days of intellectual fun and engagement around the theme of forging the Pacific century, because it is one of the great stories of this school that it had the foresight 30 years ago to understand that the center of global dynamics would shift in the 21st century from the Atlantic region to the Pacific region. And to be the center or focal point of global dynamics is to say that for us to remain true to our heritage and to our mission, we have to continue to build and invest and teach around that core bet of being the best in the United States on understanding the dynamics of the Pacific, which we simply define as all of the Americas and all of Asia. But at the same time, that success of becoming foremost in understanding the Pacific as a pivotal point in the world has really led to a second generation of building around that success to understand the implications of the Pacific century for the world as a whole and the challenges of the world as a whole, ranging not just from the interactions of states, but to the dynamics at the local region here in San Diego, state and national for every government and society around the world, and from dealing with the problems of the commons of the world, such as climate and sustainability. Those are the investments that we're making to complement that original expertise and vision around the Pacific. Today, I have one of those special moments of pleasure of being able to tee off a moment when you can see what an extraordinary faculty, both those who have been with us for many years and those who have joined us in recent years, have formed. They're a community of scholars that are noted in the world of scholarship for their deep collegiality and interdisciplinary nature. I also have to say it's really a pleasure to see them for once being silent and attentive when the dean speaks. That will only last if I leave the podium shortly. So as you look upon this faculty, recognize that they share certain values besides that notion of forging together across their disciplinary lines to tackle fundamental questions facing the world. And that is that they also are committed in a way that is something all of our students and our alumni can attest to translating those tools of research which we invest so much in creating into finding a way to having a curriculum that is, in the words of the cliche, at the cutting edge, but really in spirit, providing the sort of stimulation and challenges that allow our students so successfully over the years to teach each other as much as we can teach them. So to all of you here today as our alumni, join us in sharing the pleasure of a faculty that created a moment for your mutual learning. And for all of you who are friends and supporters in the community who are watching this on webcasts, come join and get to know a faculty that is being extraordinary in exploring what the 21st century brings to global society, whether it's here at home or in other places around the world. So with that said, I'd like to turn it over to the faculty, and our first panel will be moderated by one of our economists, Professor Gordon McCord. Gordon, please.
Thank you, Peter. Good morning. It's great to be here. My name's Gordon McCord. I'm a development economist at the school. And I'm here to welcome you to our set of talks on the challenge of equality. And it's interesting for me to think about how this notion of equality has evolved, particularly from the perspective of someone like myself who's been involved with the United Nations for the last 15 years. And if you think back to before the year 2000, economists like myself working on international development really focused on economic growth as the one thing that we were really pushing in the 1980s and 1990s. And we said, look, social policy, environmental policy, inequality, let's just not worry about those things, because in the poorest countries of the world, we just need to make the economic pie bigger and the economy needs to grow. And that was the prevailing thinking. And economists were talking like that, and it was political scientists and folks in other fields saying, well, wait a minute, this kind of unbalanced growth should in fact not only not be what we're after, but in fact can be quite dangerous for society in lots of ways. And then after the year 2000, you'll remember, or some of you might remember, that the international community organized itself around the Millennium Development Goals framework. And so we moved away from just saying we should care about economic growth to saying we should care about growth, but also about raising the level of well-being of the poorest among us all over the world. But equality and inequality was never explicitly part of what was talked about. It was really about the health and the education and the income levels of the poorest among us. And that lasted for 15 years. After the year 2015, the world leaders came back together and came up with the Sustainable Development Goal framework that we're now in through 2030, under which the international system organizes itself. And now inequality is front and center in the middle of everything that the system's trying to do, and the reduction of inequality has really come to be recognized as something that's fundamental as a goal that countries should strive, not only poor countries, but rich countries as well. And so it's in this milieu that I'm delighted to introduce 5 of my colleagues, economists and political scientists, who are at the forefront of thinking, how should we think about equality and the reduction of inequality from the point of view of political dynamics and economic dynamics. And I'm going to introduce them in alphabetical order. So first is Professor John Ahlquist. John is an associate professor in political science. His work is on political economy, income inequality, labor markets, and trade. And he'll be speaking to us about the socio-economic weather stations. John.
Good morning. Good morning. All right. Waking everybody up. So consistent with the theme of this celebration so far, which has really actually been very forward-looking in the future and future-facing, I'm going to talk to you not about stuff I've done in the past, but about a big picture, ongoing institution-building project that I'm at the very early stages of. But because it's a very long journey, I'm going to talk about some of the initial baby steps that we're starting here at UCSD and how that might play out. So I spend a lot of time thinking about work, employment relations, labor, and social insurance policies. And so as a result, I've been part of a bunch of conversations about the future of work, the future of labor, where are things going. And as a result, or part of those conversations, I become increasingly convinced that it's not clear that we really actually have a good handle on where things are going. So in particular, social insurance, those are the sets of rules and regulations and policies that we have in place that are basically designed to prevent people from falling into outright destitution simply due to a lost job or an injury or even through aging. And we can really credit, at least in the United States and most of the industrialized world, we can credit the greatest generation, the people that came up in the Depression and World War II, with the design, the development, the political fight, and the implementation of those policies. But as a result, the policies we have in place really embed and have as at their core a vision of a job and an employment contract that looks like something from the 1940s and the 1950s, and also of a household and neighborhoods. And this matters because how we count work, how we count jobs, has strong consequences for how well our social safety nets function, and who falls through, who doesn't, who gets what, and so forth. So let me give you a specific example. What it means to have a job or go to work is changing. We think it's changing. Workers are facing new risks that are accelerating in ways that we really don't have a good handle on. So this is one example. So I don't know if you're a gamer. I'm actually myself not. I have too much other stuff to do. But this is an example from a screenshot from the Twitch broadcast platform. And if you're familiar with this, it's actually one of the biggest users of bandwidth on the internet in the world. And what happens is people go online. The woman in the corner here is the broadcaster, and she, in real time, is streaming herself playing a massive online multiplayer video game. And all along the side there, you see people coming online, watching her play and interacting with her and others, and actually giving her money for the privilege of sitting there and watching her play this video game. And this is an income stream, and it can be quite successful for some people. And there's a variety of things that are cropping up around the world that have this feeling for it. So is this work? Should we count it as work? Does she have a skill? And these are questions that our current systems are not set up to answer or to tell us anything about. And in particular, this person does not have any protections for minimum wage. She spent a bunch of time and effort becoming really good at this one particular video game, or maybe two. What happens if that game is no longer popular and her income stream dries up? Or what happens if the economy goes into recession in general and people are no longer willing or able to send her money or as much money as she had before? What then? Is she going to fall through the cracks? And I'm here to tell you that we really actually don't have a good handle on this. We can't tell you how widespread this is, how fast it's growing. And as some of my colleagues around that you'll hear from later have done great work showing the geographic dispersion in opportunity and reward in our economy. We don't know where this is happening or growing. So in other words, I want to talk to you today about something that you might consider boring. It's infrastructure. And we know from an experience in Minneapolis a few years ago what happens if we fail to maintain and invest in our infrastructure. But I'm not going to talk to you about bridges and roads and dams, as critical as those might be. I'm going to talk to you about a different kind of infrastructure, and that is our public data employment, federal statistical agencies measurement infrastructure. It's important, we need this widely accessible, reliable, and it's critical that it's public and verifiable, and we can all coordinate on the same sets of numbers and measurements over time. And this is an extraordinary service that we've built up in this country and around the world. And like many aspects of our infrastructure, it is potentially weakening. So we're facing the typical problems of disinvestment. So for example, the spending on federal statistical agencies in the United States right now is about 10% lower than it was on average between 2004 and 2013. But that's not just the challenge that I'm going to focus on here. The challenge is more fundamental. In particular, our tools for understanding work and employment are old and getting outdated. They rely on sending out surveys. They rely on calling people on phones that they just don't answer anymore. Knocking on doors, and people now have cameras on their doorbells and may not want to talk to you if they don't know who you are. And this old way is very top-down, it's observational, and there's lots of evidence that it's getting less reliable, more expensive, and the questions we're asking are not necessarily keeping up with the way we think the world might be changing. And if we don't figure out new ways of asking questions or eliciting data and information from people, we're not going to know what's going on, and we're going to make worse decisions as policymakers, as business people, and as citizens and workers. So let's take a step back then. What, if we could start rebuilding or changing or improving things, what would we like this new data infrastructure to be able to do or to have? Well, I'll give you a few ideas. One thing that we're getting used to now is we'd like it to be always on. That is to say, it's always collecting data from wherever it's appearing and being able to ingest it into an understandable format that we can then access later on, as opposed to being very episodic, idiosyncratic, and fixed in time. We want it to be bottom-up and participatory, as opposed to top-down and observational. It has to be secure, and we have to have the best security protocols and privacy protocols in place. And we want it to be flexible. We have so many new forms of data that we've heard about. We have images, movies, unstructured text, and that can be really powerful to extract information from, and we now have tools that allow us to do that, so we don't have to force people into ordered categories necessarily. And finally, we'd like to deliver it publicly in a way that allows other people, perhaps in the private sector, to build new things on top of it that might be specialized dissemination tools targeted at specific audiences or use cases for their particular problems or needs. So Tim O'Reilly, for example, has called this government as platform, and I think that's a nice image. So where would we get some examples on this? And I'm going to tell you that we actually have a model for how this works in place already, or at least an analogy that I'm going to make. And this is that weather station analogy that's in the title. So our weather station, weather data gathering infrastructure is already out there, and it has a bunch of these attributes that I've already just described to you. We have important top-down observational, capital-intensive, government-owned and managed tools, satellites, networks of buoys, and things like that. But we also have ways of directly incorporating a whole variety of data sources or data points that are being provided around the world by private entities, individuals, people, and firms that are being fed directly into our data systems and calibrated with what we're already seeing and affect our ability to forecast and understand the weather and the climate. So in particular, I'm just going to give you one example. It's called the Citizen Weather Observer Program, and this is just an image from where we're sitting right now, the San Diego region. And each one of these dots is a house, a firm, sometimes it's a car or a boat that has telemetry on it and a weather variable measuring system, and it's feeding information into the weather system right now as we speak. So imagine if we could apply this analogy to our social data infrastructure. Suppose individual workers or households or firms could, on their own time or when it seems right, directly donate data into our system to help us understand what they're doing on the job, when and under what conditions. Imagine if we could push individual surveys at very granular moments in time and space to ask people short questions about what's going on, and they could be confident that their responses would be protected and not used against them. We could have small micro surveys, and we could ultimately, I'd like to imagine the ability to nowcast our economy, or at least our labor market, and the types of jobs and skills being used at very fine resolution in space and time. We could see new types of work and tasks and jobs emerging. Educational institutions, like where we're sitting, could adjust the timing of classes or the content much more quickly and rapidly to respond to the needs nearby. We could see people slipping through the cracks more rapidly. And that's the idea of the kind of socio-economic weather station that I'm trying to pitch for the future. And that's great, but it's obviously far more than I'm capable of delivering on my own, or even if I had, infinite graduate students and postdocs. So how can we actually make some progress in this area and try to demonstrate there's some use here, and that maybe we can attract some interest and support from people in government, at other institutions, and so forth. And so what we're doing right now is, or what I'm doing right now, is trying to triangulate. That is to say, figure out where exactly are the holes in our existing data systems that we can show that we're missing. So to that end, with the generous support of the Yankelovich Center here at UCSD, I'm convening a meeting with a bunch of the journalists, the ethnographers, the social scientists who are doing the deep, longitudinal, qualitative interview work with Americans and people elsewhere, asking them, how are you earning a living? What is it you're doing? What are you facing? Who are your employers, and how do you understand your relationship with them? Finding out what they're saying in very deep detail over time, and then bringing them into dialogue with data scientists and more quantitatively oriented social scientists to try to figure out ways that those two ways of understanding the world might be able to map together. And is there a way to build scalable tools that can have some of the benefits of these deep, unstructured, longitudinal interviews with the scale and speed of data science and data systems? So that's where we're going, and ideally that would then lead to some mini prototypes of a socioeconomic weather station, maybe something that you could experiment with in the next few years, and that's where I hope we can go to better understand the future of work and labor in this country and elsewhere.
Thanks, John. Next up is Alexander Gelber. Alex is an associate professor in the Department of Economics and at the School of Global Policy and Strategy. He's also a perfect example of the kind of faculty member that straddles top-notch academic work, but also a deep policy experience. He served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Economic Policy at the U.S. Department of Treasury and served as Acting Assistant Secretary for Economic Policy and Acting Chief Economist at Treasury as well. Alex has done extensive research on the labor market and the social safety net, and his talk today is entitled Equality and the Social Safety Net. Alex.
Thank you. Okay. All right. Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here. So in the U.S., and around the world, in countries around the world, there's a social safety net, which John talked about a bit. Government programs that are there for you if you're down on your luck or otherwise have low income. And we're in the midst of a transformation in the way that some people think about how the social safety net had been structured. So let me walk you through how it's historically been thought about and what some of the new ideas are. So historically, we were up here in the top two kind of buckets up here, transferring to people if you don't work or you can't work, or transferring to people if you do or if you do work. And more recently, people have been thinking down here, and we'll get there in a second. So let's start in the upper left corner, transferring to people if you don't work or you can't work. This is the way that historically most transfers in the United States have happened. They're means-tested transfers. So for example, if you're disabled, you can get disability insurance. If you're unemployed, you can get unemployment insurance. We had a traditional cash welfare system that went to people with low income. Relative to that, over the last 30 or 40 years, the cash transfer system has had a major evolution. Cash welfare has been cut back, and the earned income tax credit has been expanded tremendously over the last 30 or 40 years. It's now almost 4 times as large in expenditures as traditional cash welfare. And what the earned income tax credit does is it transfers to you if you do work, but doesn't give you a transfer if you don't work. And those transfers can be very large, so up to $6,500 at the federal level and almost $3,000 in California that you can get. And that's a very, very big deal if you're earning $15,000 to $20,000. So we've seen a big transformation. And while I was the acting chief economist at Treasury, as Gordon mentioned, we expanded the earned income tax credit relative to current law. So people were very excited about this. So what's happened more recently? What's happened more recently is that people have noticed that employment rates have been declining. Employment rates are now about 4 percentage points lower than they were 2 decades ago. So they peaked in 2000. They've been coming down broadly ever since, and with some ups and downs, but broadly coming down. That's due to a number of factors that people have pointed to. Automation, rising import competition, population aging. And people are worried that over the long run they may actually fall further, and in that case people might not be able to find work. And so in that case maybe an earned income tax credit makes less sense because you can give people an incentive to work, but if they can't find the jobs, then that's not going to work. And so that's led to these new sort of ideas down here, a universal basic income, which would go to you no matter what. A presidential candidate has proposed this. Some people think, maybe every American should get $10,000, or maybe this presidential candidate says every American should get $1,000, or a guaranteed job. There are a number of ideas that presidential candidates have of guaranteed jobs, for example, under a Green New Deal. So big changes in how people think about it. So on the left, you see here transfers that go to you even if you don't work. On the right, you see here transfers that go to you if you do work. Okay, so there are major trade-offs that we face when we think about how to structure the social safety net and which of these options we should choose. Economists sometimes think about the so-called iron triangle of the safety net. So, that the idea behind the iron triangle is that you can't simultaneously achieve all 3 of these goals: redistribution, cost, and encouraging work. So for example, under traditional cash welfare, it redistributes a lot to people who have no or very little income, but it doesn't encourage work. In fact, it might discourage people from getting work if they can only get the transfer if they're not working. The earned income tax credit encourages work because it gives you up to a very large transfer if you work, but it doesn't redistribute as much to people who can't find work or who are otherwise have low income. On the other hand, there are some programs that are very expensive. So for example, the universal basic income could be very expensive. If we gave every American a $1,000 check, which isn't nearly enough to cover most people's expenses, that by itself would be as expensive, roughly, as all poverty programs in the United States, excluding Medicaid. Just that $1,000 check for every American over 18. So that would be very expensive. It wouldn't redistribute as much as traditional cash welfare, and in fact, it might even discourage work, as illustrated in this cartoon. If you're getting a transfer, no matter what, then what's the incentive to work? So I've been stuck. I and a lot of other people have been stuck in this iron triangle for a long time, trying to figure out how to escape. And I've kind of just been beating my head against this issue for a really long time. But my research potentially suggests a way out of the iron triangle. So I've done a lot of work studying existing programs and what they do. And a key way out of the iron triangle is to make investments that pay off. And if those investments pay off enough, then you can redistribute. But if it's also an investment, not just a redistribution, then it has a cost, but there's a return on that investment. If those returns are big enough, then it eases that trade-off between redistribution and cost. And if those investments are big enough, sometimes they pay off in future workforce participation, and so we can ease the trade-off between redistributing and encouraging work as well. So for example, some of my research on Head Start, how Head Start can make a difference, shows that Head Start, which is a free pre-K program for children in low-income families, leads parents to be more involved with their kids and leads to better long-run outcomes. A second paper of mine looks at guaranteed jobs for low-income youth and shows that it can lead them to less crime and actually, in some cases, can actually save their life, particularly by a reduction in deaths from homicide. And some of my most recent work shows that disability insurance can actually save people's lives who are very sick. So this shows that these programs that people had traditionally thought of as redistributive programs actually can be investments that pay off. And so even though it looks like they do have a cost, and in fact they do, they can pay off more than that cost is. And so it eases that redistributive tension. The more I've been involved in policy, the more I've realized that what policymakers need is not just an understanding of what the programs do, but also predictions about what's going to happen to the economy in the future. And that's where some of my most recent work is starting to head, and where my work will probably head in the future to some extent. So I'm currently on the technical panel of the Social Security Administration. Social Security is the biggest social insurance program in the United States. $1 trillion were spent last year on the Social Security program. And we're working with the Social Security Advisory Board to try to improve Social Security's models of its finances so that we can better understand the timing and magnitude of changes that need to get made to Social Security before the trust fund runs out of money. I'm working on the future of work, trying to use the latest statistical techniques to project into the future what are jobs going to look like into the future. How much is going to be manufacturing? How much is going to be services? What are employment rates going to look like? Which is crucial also to designing the social safety net of the future. And I'm starting to work on what is the impact of climate change on the economy, and what will that look like in the future. So all of this is part of something I'm co-founding called Future Proof, which I'm very excited about, which is going to try to predict the future impacts of policy and other events on the economy, and therefore help to inform policymakers and others about the best policy now. So I just got to UCSD in July. I'm delighted to be here. I'm very grateful for the support that UCSD has given me. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thanks, Alex. Our next speaker really needs no introduction. Peter Gourevitch is the Emeritus Professor of Political Science and the founding Dean of the School of Global Policy and Strategy. He's an expert on international relations and comparative politics, specializing in political economy, and frankly, one of the most generous and thoughtful people I've met since I reached San Diego, and it's just a delight to know him. Peter will be speaking on the political drivers of inequality, what we learn by looking across borders. Peter.
Thank you. I want to continue our discussion about inequality. We all know there's inequality around the world, and what interests me is why does it differ? We also know that it differs quite a lot. There's a lot more inequality in countries like the United States and Brazil than there is in places like Scandinavia. And that fact makes us know that it's not natural. It's not like rain or earthquakes. It's not something that just happens. It is socially and politically caused. And so that's what interests me. I want to talk to you about that aspect. What do we know in looking comparatively about the drivers of inequality? What produces the public policies that lead for inequality? And before I go into that, I want to preliminary say, do we care about inequality or do we care about poverty? Are we more upset by super rich playboys and playgirls running around, or are we more upset than we are by people who don't have a roof over their head or enough to eat or enough medical care? I myself care more about the latter than the former. I don't care so very much about the playboys and the playgirls running around as I do about people who don't get enough. Those two things correlate. So if we can say that's not the thing, we're going to be worried about poverty and inequality and think about why they differ. And I think that is what we do at our school. Our school looks comparatively, not only international processes, but across countries, and we get a lot of leverage by doing that. We learn things by looking across countries. So what are we learning? Well, I think there are two contrasting views that I hear out there when I read this literature about why we have the policies that we do and what we should do about it. One view thinks that the countries that have done well in dealing with poverty do it by soaking the rich, tax the rich high, get enough money, and redistribute it to the poor. And the other view is that what we have is we have high taxes on everybody, and we use those high taxes to provide benefits to everybody. Now, I find many people believe the former. When I go around and I talk to people, I find a very strong tendency for people to think that what happens is the former of those things, and the political processes that we need are the mobilization of mass support for soaking the rich. I don't think empirical support supports that very well. I think the empirical support, when we look across countries, is that poverty reduction and equality happens in the second of these. We have policies that we tax ourselves quite highly, but we distribute the benefits to everybody. And I think that's really how Social Security and Medicare work. You pay taxes, and when you retire, the way I am now, I'm getting it back. I mean, I'm being subsidized beyond that, but I'm getting back what I paid in. That's really how it works. So the big political economy challenge to society, I think, is if that's how you deal with the kinds of programs which my colleagues study, how do we get people to be willing to tax themselves with the idea that they're going to get it back? That's really quite an extraordinary problem that requires what we call intergenerational commitment. It requires that you're really willing to believe that what you pay today, you will get back. And that requires confidence builders. People have to believe that the political system will produce that. And so my colleagues in the social sciences explore these, and I want to just mention two confidence builders that are particularly striking to me comparatively. One confidence builder has to do with political systems. A lot of people have done research comparing political systems that have distinguished political systems that emphasize consensus. One example of that would be proportional representation. Proportional representation, you have more than one candidate per district, people vote, and the number of seats is allocated according to the percentage of each vote. Well, what that produces is that even the weak get some representation, and that tends to produce coalitions and some kind of accommodation, and there's some evidence that that produces programs to protect the weak. The contrast to that is majoritarian systems, the winner-take-all politics. There's one candidate, the plurality wins, and that's what happens, and that's what the United States and the UK have, and some people argue that is producing polarized politics of what we have, and that produces weaker defense, less defense of the weak, and therefore more inequality. So that's one very important difference. Another kind of confidence building, I think, lies in the economy, in our economic institutions, and that's the distinction between stakeholder and shareholder systems. In a shareholder system, you see the firm is entirely in the control of the shareholders, and nobody else has any voice. In a stakeholder system, lots of people have a voice, including the employees. In Germany and Scandinavia, you have institutions where the employees have some representation on boards. There's some evidence that this produces policies, that produces the kind of policies, the kind of consensus building, that produces policies that support the weak. So I want to suggest that these are two examples of confidence building things that reassure populations, that make them then support policies which do something serious about controlling poverty and inequality. And I think those are just two mechanisms, but by looking around the world at different countries and understanding what happens in different countries, we can learn a lot and possibly import back into the United States things that we learned from other countries that are very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Our next speaker is Zoltan Hajnal. Professor Hajnal is a professor of political science at the School of Global Policy and Strategy. He's a scholar of racial and ethnic politics, urban politics, immigration, and political behavior. Zoli also helped lead the creation of our new Masters in Public Policy program at the school and a large expansion of our U.S.-focused curriculum. So delighted to welcome him, and he'll be speaking on America's racial divide and its political consequences. Zoli.
Thanks, Gordon. Yeah, I'm going to talk to you all about American democracy. So we're a little more parochial, smaller, but America's a pretty big country. So, and I want us to think about ways in which we might help the disadvantaged in American democracy and ways in which we can make American democracy maybe slightly more equitable. I'm going to do that by introducing you to Bo and Deshaun, two middle-aged men. I actually don't know Bo or Deshaun at all, never met either one of them. But I do know a fair amount about them and about their political views. So Bo and Deshaun are similar in a lot of different ways. So they're getting into retirement age. They're both single. They're both very much working class. So neither Bo nor Deshaun has graduated from college. And both of them are sort of struggling to get by, minimum wage, poverty levels, essentially. Both are also from the South and from the state of Georgia in particular. So lots of similarities. They're different in one aspect, or at least one key aspect, and that is race. Bo is white, as his made-up name is meant to suggest, and Deshaun is African American, as his assigned name is also meant to suggest for him as well. Why do I highlight that difference? I'm going to show that race is the single most important demographic factor shaping American democracy. So race is critically important when we determine who we vote for. Race, and even more, I'd say important, race is the most important determinant of who wins and who loses in American democracy. So whether you're on the winning side or losing side of the vote, whether you're on the winning side or losing side of policy. Now, I am going to show you that American democracy is racially uneven, but I don't want to be totally negative. So I'm going to sort of think about moving forward and think about different ways in which we can make American democracy more equitable. But I'm not going to give that away yet, so you gotta keep listening. Let's start with division first. So despite that America is now a nation of inequality, we're facing sort of some of the highest levels of income inequality that we have ever experienced. Despite that, I'm going to sort of suggest that race is the most, race more than class is what divides us. So if we take Bo and Deshaun, despite the fact that both are poor, they have sort of almost diametrically opposed political preferences. So Bo, the white man, is fairly conservative. So he opposes gun control. He opposes Obamacare. He favors the death penalty. When he votes, he always votes Republican. By contrast, Deshaun, the African-American male, is largely liberal. He favors gun control. He really wants to raise the minimum wage. He'd like Obamacare to be expanded. He votes Democrat every time he votes as well. So that's division, sort of suggesting that despite the fact that they're similar by class, they differ greatly in terms of their preferences. Now let's think about outcomes, who wins and who loses. So again, despite the fact that they have strikingly similar economic circumstances, Bo and Deshaun end up, by most available measures, on opposite ends of American democracy. Bo, the white man, generally wins. Deshaun, the African-American, generally loses. So when Bo was asked in a 2016 survey who he voted for in the presidential election, he said, of course, Trump, and we all know that Trump won. Bo was asked about a series of other elections, statewide and federal. In every single case, the candidate that he voted for ended up winning the election. Bo was winning not just on sort of in terms of outcomes in the vote, but also on policy. So Georgia has one of the highest uninsured rates in the nation. Bo supports that, or at least he doesn't mind that at all. Georgia has some of the lowest or the most lax gun control laws in the nation. Bo supports that as well. Georgia uses the death penalty. Bo is quite happy with that. And by contrast, Deshaun is generally a loser in American democracy. So most of the policies that he wants enacted tend not to come to fruition. So he wants the minimum wage to be increased in Georgia. Georgia's minimum wage of $5.15 is tied for the lowest in the country. He wants strict gun control laws. Again, Georgia has some of the most lax gun control laws. Almost anybody can own any kind of gun they want in Georgia. He wants Obamacare to be expanded in a state where Obamacare is essentially shunned. So again, the pattern is the white man's generally winning, the African-American male is generally losing. Now, these are two individuals, perhaps a nice anecdote, but is it really true that more broadly race is a factor that helps determine, or maybe the most important factor that helps determine who wins and who loses in American democracy? So to answer that sort of broader question, I looked at a range of surveys. So in fact, over the last half century, about 500,000 Americans have been asked their preferences on policy. And then I've looked to see whether those preferences were enacted, and in particular, whose preferences were enacted and whose views were ignored. So more specifically, the General Social Survey over the last 4 decades has asked about 500,000 Americans whether they want increases or decreases in different aspects of federal government spending. So now we're looking at the national government, and in the survey, individual Americans are asked, should we increase or decrease spending on on exactly 11 different policy areas, things like military spending, welfare spending, transportation. The 11 areas don't cover all aspects of spending, but they cover the majority of the budget. So I went, compiled all that data, and then looked to see whether the federal government actually spent money in the ways that people wanted it to spend money. So if I, as an individual, said in a certain year that I would like welfare spending to be increased, I then looked to see whether in the next year the federal government actually spent more money on welfare or not. So did it listen to me or did it ignore me? You then do that for all 500,000 people across the 11 policy areas, across the 4 decades of data. When you do that, you find a few things. Number one, and probably most encouragingly, it appears that American democracy is pretty responsive. So a lot of the time, government did what most of the American population wanted it to do. Secondly, for most of the groups, demographic groups I looked at, there weren't big differences in terms of who wins and who loses. So men versus women, young versus old, there weren't big differences. But as you can see here, behind me, there is one variable that sort of sticks out, and that's race at the very top, right? So what you see is that blacks are losing relative to whites significantly more than any other group is losing to its sort of comparison group. And so here, the gap's not massive. Controlling for all these demographic factors, controlling for some other factors that aren't in the figure, I find that blacks are likely to lose on policy 5% more of the time than whites. And importantly, that black-white gap that you see at the top is far larger than the gap by gender. It's far larger than the gaps by class. It's even larger than the gaps by party or ideology. Now, we can look at all that and say, maybe that isn't so bad. In a democracy, there's going to be winners and losers, absolutely. And we can also say whites are a majority in this nation. Blacks are a minority, and therefore, why wouldn't we expect whites to have more of a say? All of that, I think, is reasonable to argue. What I will say is this becomes a bit more of a problem if the group that's losing is consistently losing time and time again. And when I dug in deeper into the data, that's essentially what you find. So African Americans are losing consistently in the vote more than whites. They're losing consistently on policy issue after policy issue in year after year. So if you're Deshaun, you're already struggling. You're trying to get by, and you're finding that government is doing essentially the opposite of what you want, time after time, policy after policy. It's obviously going to be discouraging, eroding your sense of belonging, may lead to resentment, and potentially even aggression. The other thing that might make this pattern be something that we really care about is whether we can explain it, right? So can we explain why blacks are losing more? And I can't explain it. So the figure that you see here is essentially looking at the racial gap and these other gaps after controlling for all the things that we think might matter in terms of winning and losing in American democracy. So blacks are not losing more than whites because they tend to be disproportionately poor, disproportionately less well educated. And also, strikingly, this incorporates your partisanship, your ideology, and whether you want a spending increase or decrease. So blacks are not losing more than whites because they're overwhelmingly liberal, largely democratic. In fact, when I do further analysis, I find that even when blacks have exactly the same policy preferences at the same time as whites, their preferences are weighed less heavily than white preferences are. So what this is telling us essentially is that blacks are consistently losing more than whites, and there does appear to be some discrimination in that process. And that is probably something that we should care about. Now, that's all negative so far. I want to sort of think about, is there anything we can do to make American democracy more equitable? Recall that I said that blacks lose most of the time in most years, right? And that's true, but there are some years when, relative to whites, blacks are not losing that much, and there are even some extraordinary years when blacks win on policy just as much as whites. So my next task was essentially to say, okay, what explains that variation over time? And what I found was that which political party controls the lever of power is the single most important determinant of whether American democracy is sort of racially balanced or whether there are imbalances or inequities. So when Republicans control the presidency in Congress, there is a fairly large, about an 8.5 point racial gap in policy responsiveness. By contrast, when Democrats control both the presidency and Congress, that racial imbalance effectively goes away, and American government responds relatively equally to each racial and ethnic group. So if we care about Deshaun and we want him to feel as a full member of American democracy, if we care about both Deshaun and Beau and we want them each to have an equal opportunity, and if we care about American democracy and want it to be as fair as it can be, there is, in some sense, a pathway forward. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Zoli. So I'm particularly delighted to invite our final speaker for the session up to the stage, not only because she is among our newest faculty members, but also as somebody who grew up in Chile. She and I share a Southern Cone camaraderie. Agustina Paglayan is an assistant professor in political science at GPS. Her research seeks to explain why some politicians, but not others, adopt public policies conducive to economic development, with a special focus on the political economy of education. And Agustina will be speaking to us on the global learning crisis. Agustina.
Thank you, Gordon. Thank you. It's great to be here and to be talking about such an important subject, which is what can we do about the high levels of inequality and the persistent levels of poverty that we face. And I think we couldn't have a panel about this where we don't talk about education. And we all think about education as being the great equalizer, and we all expect so many things from our education system. But I think we can all agree that at a very minimum, our elementary schools, or primary schools, the way we call them in other parts of the world, at a minimum, they should ensure that every kid can read, write, add, and subtract. Pretty basic. And what might be surprising for some of you to know or to learn is that what's happened in the last many, many decades around the world, or the 20th century, frankly, is that countries have done a terrific job in terms of expanding access to education. And in almost every single country in the world today, every kid has access to universal primary education. But the problem that we're facing is that kids go to primary school and essentially learn very basic skills. And when I say very basic skills, I really mean that. And so this thing that we face today, where we have kids going to school, we've managed to achieve universal primary education, but kids aren't learning, that's what people often refer to these days as the learning crisis. Let me go back to this thing that I said, that I'm really talking about Shakespeare. So what I'm going to show you, not really talking about Shakespeare. I'm not talking about Shakespeare. I'm talking about really basic reading skills. So what I'm going to show you here is a video where you're going to read in silence, please. On the right, how fast kids can read a sentence on average in rich countries, and on the left, the same sentence but how fast it's read by kids in poor countries on average. And on both cases, this is going to be looking at kids who are in 3rd grade, so not kids who are not in school, okay? So remember silence, and we'll go, and then we'll reconvene. At best. Did that make you uncomfortable? Okay, I hope so. That was exactly my point. I was hoping you were going to feel uncomfortable, because this discomfort is really what the learning crisis is, and what drives me to do the research I do, which is basically try to understand, why do we have this problem? Why is it that so many kids, and not just in poor countries, low-income kids in the US face very similar issues? Why do our schools fail so massively at teaching kids how to read, how to write, how to add and subtract? And what can we do about it? And so, if you ask a lot of people who study education what is behind this crisis, well, what they're going to tell you is, look, the problem is governments just don't know how to promote learning. They don't have the right education policies in place. And what we need to do is we need to do a lot of studies that are super expensive, but are going to be completely worth to run them, to figure out what are the right policies to recruit the best people into teaching, what are the right policies to incentivize the people who are already teachers to put a lot of effort into their work. And then we're going to go and tell governments, look, these are the right policies to promote learning, and hopefully they're going to adopt them. And I see some faces like, meh, meh, meh. Right? This is pretty obvious. So it ends being the case that we've done a lot of those studies, we have a pretty good sense about how to promote learning, and yet governments are not adopting those policies. And so that brings us to what I study, which is politics. I think the key question that we need to address if we want to solve this learning crisis is we need to figure out what motivates politicians to provide education in the first place, to adopt the education policies that they choose to adopt, and what can we do, given what politicians think, the way that they think about it, to try to persuade them to incorporate the right policies. And so, on that note, and going back a little bit to what some of you may have heard from Steven Pinker yesterday saying, in the last many years, I've been studying how politics shapes education policy making. And one of the things that I've learned is that many of our intuitions are wrong. That, for example, we tend to think that education policy tends to be heavily influenced by teacher unions, and that if we're not doing a good job, then it must be because the teacher unions are blocking it. Well, that happens not to be supported by the data. Similarly, if we look at, is it that some countries are doing really poorly because they don't have voting rights for their citizens, and so people can't hold their politicians accountable? If they could, we would be doing much better. That's again not supported by the data. Politicians don't respond very much to voters when they're making education policy choices. And lastly, you may also be very surprised to learn that if you look at the history of education and primary education in particular, which is a 200-year history, then in terms of what politicians were thinking when they were expanding primary education over that 200-year period, industrialization and the idea of using education or primary education to promote industrialization or economic growth wasn't really at the top of their minds. So what is it that led to this expansion of primary education, and why is it that countries today have education for everyone? What I've found in my research is that what is behind the government's incentive to provide education is civil wars, peasant revolts, and in general, instances of widespread social disorder that made politicians really fearful that they might actually lose power if they weren't able to control the population. And so what they did in those contexts of domestic conflict was turn to primary education as a way to indoctrinate the masses and to teach them to be obedient citizens who were going to be docile and respectful of the rule of law, respectful of authority. And the way they were going to do this was by teaching them very early on to respect authority, teaching them very early on to respect the teacher, comply with instructions that they were being provided, sit in silence, and even ask for permission by raising their hand when they wanted to go to the bathroom. So the idea was that if we learned at that very early age to respect authority, then through the rest of our lives, we were going to continue being respectful of authority and never rebel against the state's authority again. And so now we get a better sense of why we have this learning crisis. And what I want to say is we don't really have a crisis, because a crisis is something we use that word to refer to with things have been going pretty well, and then suddenly things get really bad. But what we have here is a problem of low learning, but it's not a crisis. It's a structural problem that's embedded in what primary education emerged to do. Primary education systems didn't emerge and were not designed to help people flourish and develop their full potential and become empowered citizens. They were designed the way that they were designed and that we still run them today to make people obedient and to forge social order, which is the #1 function of any state. And so, on that depressing note, I'm going to tell you, well, because obviously, as I said before, the point of my research is ultimately to understand how can we make things better. And so, what I've also learned along the way is that there is space for hope. And if I take, for example, a policy that many of you here may care about, which is STEM in the classroom, and we look at the last 100 years of curriculum reforms in Latin America, and when have governments chosen to introduce more teaching of math and science in the classroom, what you see is first that they have done it sometimes, and second, that they've done it oftentimes when what they wanted to do was to weaken the power of the Catholic Church, specifically focusing on Latin America. And they introduced a lot of STEM, not because they were particularly interested in promoting a lot of math and a lot of science, but because they thought that if they taught people how to reason, then that was going to weaken their religious beliefs. And I think what this illustrates is a broader point, which is that politicians often adopt the right policies or the policies that we here might think are desirable and we want them to introduce them for other reasons, for the wrong reasons if you want. But that doesn't matter. It's fine by me. I think the key thing that we need to understand if we want to reduce this problem of low learning that we're facing is we need to understand what motivates politicians. And once we understand what motivates them, then we can have a conversation where we are actually persuading them that it is in their own best interest to introduce these policies that we know promote learning. Thank you very much.